The Duke of Stannard had not been home 2 minutes before Mrs. Halkett appeared at the foot of the stairs with an expression he had never seen her wear, a kind of careful blankness that suggested something had gone very wrong, and she had decided, quite firmly, not to be the one to say what. "Your Grace," she said. "Welcome home." Ambrose handed his riding gloves to Ridley, who took them with the same studied neutrality. 2 servants, both blank. That was not nothing. "Where is the Duchess?" he asked. Mrs. Halkett's gaze moved involuntarily toward the ceiling, toward the first floor, toward the east corridor where the principal bedchamber had stood undisturbed for the 11 years since his father's death, occupied, as it had always been, by his mother. "She is upstairs, Your Grace. In the—" a pause so slight it might have been a breath. "In the Duchess's rooms." Ambrose removed his hat slowly. The Duchess's rooms. Not the guest chamber in the west wing where Matilda's things had been placed upon their arrival 3 days ago. Not the morning room where she had taken her breakfast with perfect composure while his mother presided over the dining table as though she had not noticed the new wedding ring at all. The Duchess's rooms, the principal bedchamber, his mother's room. "I see," he said, though he did not see it all. He took the stairs 2 at a time. The marriage had been arranged with the efficiency of a land transaction, which, in every meaningful sense, it was. Sir Randall Lacey held 3,000 acres along the eastern boundary of the Stannard estate, land that Ambrose's father had tried to acquire for 20 years and failed. Sir Randall had a daughter of marriageable age and no sons. The negotiation had taken 4 months. The courtship, such as it was, had taken 3 weeks. Ambrose had not objected. He was 31. He needed an heir, and his seat in the House of Lords required a stable household behind it, or so his mother had informed him in her particular way that made practical instruction sound like a matter of national obligation. Matilda Lacey was, from what he could observe across 2 dinners and a walk through her father's gardens, a quiet, self-possessed young woman of 24 who seemed unlikely to cause difficulty. She had good teeth, good posture, and an unsettling habit of watching him with steady hazel eyes that gave away nothing whatsoever. His mother had chosen her. That was the pertinent fact. Eugenia Kendrick, Dowager Duchess of Stannard, had surveyed the eligible women of 3 counties and selected Matilde Lacey with the same precision she applied to the rotation of crops and the management of household accounts. The girl was well-bred, well-mannered, and, Eugenia had noted with satisfaction, entirely without social ambition. She would not interfere. What Eugenia had not accounted for, what no one had accounted for because Matilda had given no indication of it whatsoever, was that the new Duchess of Stannard had walked into the house with her eyes wide open. She had seen the seating at dinner. She had seen which chair his mother occupied at the head of the table, which keys hung from her chatelaine, which servants looked to her before answering the new Duchess's requests. She had seen the placement of her own trunks in the West Wing guest chamber, comfortable, well-appointed, and unmistakably secondary. She had noted, with the same quiet precision she applied to everything, that the household accounts were kept in the Dowager's parlor, that the cook presented menus to the Dowager each morning, and that Haslam, the steward, reported to Eugenia at 10 o'clock without fail, as though the title had never passed at all. And she had said nothing. For 3 days, she had said nothing. She had eaten her breakfast in the morning room, walked the gardens with Prue in the afternoon, read by candlelight in the West Wing guest chamber at night, and given every appearance of a woman content with the arrangements as they stood. Mrs. Halkett had watched her and concluded, with a housekeeper's finely tuned instinct for domestic weather, that the new Duchess was either remarkably docile or remarkably patient. On the morning of the 4th day, the morning Ambrose had ridden out to inspect the drainage work on the lower fields, Matilda had rung for Prue, her lady's maid, and asked her to have the trunks moved. "To which room, ma'am?" Prue had asked, already suspecting the answer. "To the Duchess's bedchamber," Matilda had replied, in the same tone she might have used to request a fresh pot of tea. Prue, to her credit, had not flinched. She had gone downstairs, found Ridley, and between them they had managed the thing in 40 minutes. The trunks, the dressing case, the jewelry box with the amber clasp that had been Matilda's mother's, the 3 books she kept beside her pillow, the small watercolor of her father's house that she had propped on the windowsill of the guest chamber, and now placed on the mantelpiece of the principal bedroom. All of it carried along the east corridor and into the rooms that still smelled, faintly, of Eugenia's preferred lavender water. No one had told the dowager. No one had dared. Mrs. Halkett had been in the still room when the trunks passed. She had heard the footsteps, counted the trips, and remained exactly where she was, sorting dried herbs with hands that did not tremble because she had been a housekeeper for 23 years and had learned that certain domestic storms could not be prevented, only survived. Eugenia had discovered it herself when she returned from her morning correspondence in the small parlor she had claimed as her own, another room that was, by rights, the Duchess's, and found the door to her bedchamber open, the wardrobe rearranged, and Matilda Lacey seated at the dressing table, unpinning her hair with calm, unhurried fingers. The silence that followed lasted approximately 9 seconds. Mrs. Halkett, who had emerged from the still room and was passing in the corridor when she heard the footsteps stop, counted them. "I beg your pardon," Eugenia said, in a voice that could have frosted glass. "I believe you have made an error." Matilda turned on the stool. Her hands remained in her hair, one pin held between her fingers, catching the light from the window. She looked at her mother-in-law with the same steady, hazel-eyed regard she had given Ambrose across the dinner table during their courtship, measuring, composed, giving nothing. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. "I hope you will forgive the disruption. I have asked Prue to have your things moved to the blue room in the west wing. It has the better morning light, I understand." Eugenia did not move from the doorway. She was a tall woman, still handsome at 57, with iron gray hair, dressed immaculately, and the carriage of someone who had not been contradicted in over a decade. The late Duke had been a gentle, accommodating man who had found it simpler to agree with his wife than to argue, and Ambrose had inherited this tendency along with the title, the estates, and the seat in the House of Lords that he occupied with the same mild, agreeable detachment he applied to everything else. "The blue room," Eugenia repeated. "It is quite comfortable. I inspected it this morning. This is my bedchamber." Matilda set the pin down on the dressing table with a small, precise click. "It is the Duchess's bedchamber," she said, "and I am the Duchess." That was the moment. Had either woman been a different sort of person, when a scene might have erupted. Voices raised, servants summoned, tears or fury or both. In the novels Matilda had read as a girl, this was where someone swept from the room. In the world Eugenia had governed for 30 years, this was where authority was reasserted with a single cutting remark and the matter was closed. Neither of those things happened. Eugenia stood in the doorway. Matilda sat at the dressing table. The candles on the mantelpiece, 3 of them, beeswax, still burning from Matilda's earlier toilette, cast a warm, steady light across both their faces. Outside, a thrush was singing in the lime avenue, and somewhere below them in the kitchens, someone was rolling pastry for the afternoon's tart. The house continued around them. The standoff did not. That was the scene Ambrose walked into when he reached the first-floor landing, still smelling of horses and field mud, and turned the corner toward the east corridor to find Mrs. Halkett standing 3 yards from the open door like a sentry who had been given no orders. He looked at Mrs. Halkett. Mrs. Halkett looked at the doorway. He followed her gaze, his mother in the doorway, rigid and magnificent, his wife at the dressing table, composed and immovable. The air between them charged with something that was not anger. It was too controlled for anger, but which carried the same weight as a drawn blade. "Ah," Ambrose said. Both women looked at him. He understood in that moment with the perfect clarity that sometimes arrives too late to be useful, that he had made a serious error. Not today. Today was merely the consequence. The error had been made 3 days ago when he had allowed his mother to place his new wife in the guest chamber and said nothing. He had noticed it. He had thought briefly that it was not quite right. And then he had decided that it was not worth the conversation because conversations with his mother were exhausting and Matilda had not complained. Matilda had not complained because Matilda, he was beginning to understand, did not complain. She corrected. "Ambrose," his mother said, in the tone she had used when he was 12 and had been caught writing without permission. "Your wife appears to have moved her belongings into my rooms. I trust you will speak to her." Matilda said nothing. She simply looked at him. Not with appeal, not with defiance, with patience. The particular devastating patience of a woman who already knew what was right and was waiting to see whether he did. He got it wrong. "Perhaps," he said, hearing the weakness in his own voice even as he spoke. "We might discuss this at luncheon, when everyone has had a chance to—" "There is nothing to discuss," Eugenia said. "There is nothing to discuss," Matilda agreed from the dressing table. They meant entirely different things. Ambrose looked between them. His mother's jaw was set in the way that preceded absolute commands. His wife's hands were folded in her lap with the stillness of someone who had planted a flag and intended to remain beside it. "Mother," he said, and regretted it immediately, because the word itself was a concession. It positioned him as a son, not as the Duke, and Eugenia heard it and straightened almost imperceptibly with the satisfaction of a woman who had already won. "I suggest," Eugenia said in a voice that was not a suggestion, "that we allow Prue to return your wife's things to the West Wing, and we shall say no more about it." Matilda stood. The movement was unhurried. She smoothed her skirt, pale muslin, cream-colored with a narrow satin ribbon at the empire waist, and crossed to the window, where she adjusted the curtain to let in more of the afternoon light. The gesture was small, domestic, and entirely proprietary. It was the gesture of a woman arranging her own room. Eugenia's nostrils flared, very slightly. "Enough." "Ambrose," Eugenia said again. He opened his mouth to speak, to agree, to smooth, to postpone, and Matilda turned from the window. "Your Grace," she said, addressing Eugenia with flawless courtesy, "I mean you no disrespect. This house is fortunate to have had your stewardship for so many years, and I would be foolish not to learn from your example. But the principal bedchamber is the Duchess's by custom and by right. It has been so in every great house in England for longer than either of us has been alive. I do not ask for it. It is mine." She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Ambrose for support. She spoke as though stating a fact of architecture. The room faced east, the windows were 12-paned, and the chamber belonged to her. All equally true, all equally beyond argument. Eugenia's color rose. Not dramatically, she was too controlled for that, but enough that Mrs. Halkett, still stationed in the corridor, took a small, involuntary step backward. "You presume," Eugenia said, "a great deal for a woman who has been in this house 4 days." "3, Matilda corrected gently. "But the length of my residence does not alter the customs of the peerage." The silence that followed was extraordinary. Ambrose, standing between them like a man caught in a doorway during a storm, felt something shift in the room that he could not name. It was not that his mother had been defeated. Eugenia Kendrick had never been defeated in anything, but that she had, for the first time in Ambrose's memory, encountered someone who would not move, would not yield, would not move. The distinction was important. Yielding implied a contest. Matilda was not contesting anything. She was simply present in a room that was hers, with a fact that could not be argued. Eugenia turned to Ambrose. "You will not permit this." And Ambrose, who had spent 31 years accommodating his mother's certainties because it was easier than resisting them, heard himself say the weakest possible thing. Perhaps if Matilda were to take the blue room temporarily, while Matilda looked at him, not with anger, with something worse, a brief, clear-eyed assessment, as though she were revising a calculation she had hoped she would not have to revise. She had measured him across those dinner tables in that garden walk. She had concluded that he was decent, if unformed. She was adjusting that conclusion now, and he could feel it happening, could feel the quiet withdrawal of something he had not yet earned and was in danger of losing before he understood its worth. "The blue room is charming," Matilda said, still looking at him. "Your mother will be very comfortable there." Eugenia made a sound that was not quite a word. Ambrose left. He was not proud of it. He went downstairs, crossed the entrance hall, past Ridley, who was polishing the same candlestick he had been polishing for the last hour, a man performing the ancient servant's art of being present while witnessing nothing, and walked out through the garden door into the lime avenue, where the thrush was still singing with offensive cheerfulness. He walked for 20 minutes. He walked past the walled garden, past the lake where the swans drifted with the aimless superiority of creatures who had never been asked to choose between two impossible women, past the folly his grandfather had built in a moment of architectural enthusiasm that the family had regretted ever since. He walked until his boots were muddy again, and his breathing had slowed, and the image of his wife's face, that brief recalibrating look, had settled into his chest like a stone. She had not asked him to choose. That was the thing. His mother had demanded it, had said, "You will not permit this," which was a command disguised as an expectation, and he had responded to the command because that was what he had always done. Matilda had simply waited to see what he would do, and what he had done was nothing. Worse than nothing, he had suggested a compromise that was not a compromise at all, but a capitulation dressed in polite language, and she had seen through it instantly because Matilda Lacey, Matilda Kendrick, saw through everything. He thought of the 3 days since their arrival, her composure at the dining table while his mother occupied the head, her quiet, "Good morning, Mrs. Halkett," to a housekeeper who still looked to Eugenia before answering, her unhurried tour of the house on the second day when she had walked through every room with Prue beside her, opening curtains and counting linens and asking no one's permission because she did not need permission to walk through her own house. She had been taking inventory, not of the silver and the porcelain, though she had noted those too, of the power, who held it, how it was exercised, where it was stored. She had mapped the household the way a general maps terrain before engagement, and when she was ready, when she understood precisely what she was facing, she had moved her trunks. He thought of their wedding 12 days ago, the church at Stannard, filled with white roses his mother had chosen, the breakfast afterward where Eugenia had sat at the head of the table and made the first toast, and Matilda had listened with her hands folded in her lap and her hazel eyes steady on the dowager's face. He had thought at the time that she was being respectful. He understood now that she had been paying attention. He turned back toward the house. Haslam, the steward, intercepted him in the entrance hall with a question about the drainage costs that Ambrose answered without hearing a word of his own reply. He took the stairs slowly this time. The corridor was empty. Mrs. Halkett had retreated to whatever safe harbor housekeepers withdrew to when the household weather turned dangerous, and the bedroom door was closed. He knocked. "Come in," Matilda said. She was seated in the chair beside the fireplace, his mother's chair, the one with the needlework cushion Eugenia had stitched herself 20 years ago, reading a book. Her hair was fully unpinned now, falling past her shoulders in a way he had not seen before, and the intimacy of it startled him. They had been married 12 days, and he had seen her in full dress, in morning dress, in the careful social armor she wore at dinner. He had not seen her like this, unguarded, domestic, at rest in her own room. The room was warm, 3 candles on the mantelpiece, 2 on the writing desk, 1 on the nightstand beside the bed where his mother had slept for 30 years, where Matilda's books now sat on the pillow. "I owe you an apology," he said from the doorway. She closed the book over one finger, marking her place. "Yes," she said, "you do." He had not expected her to agree so readily. His mother would have made him work for the admission, drawn it out, required several approaches, perhaps a gift, certainly a period of frost. Matilda simply confirmed the fact and waited for what came next. "I should not have suggested you take the blue room." "No, these are your rooms, by right and by custom." "Yes." He crossed the threshold. She watched him come, her expression neither warm nor cold, watchful, still measuring, but no longer revising. Waiting. "I have spent my life finding it easier to agree with my mother than to disagree," he said. "That is not a virtue. It is a habit, and it is one I shall have to break." Matilda regarded him for a long moment. The candlelight caught the amber in her hair and threw soft shadows across the book in her lap. She was not beautiful in the way the season celebrated. She was too still for that, too contained, her features too serious for the fashion that rewarded dimples and animation. But there was something in her face when she chose to let it show, a quiet, luminous warmth, like the last hour of afternoon light before it fades. "Your mother is not a villain, Ambrose," she said. "She has run this house alone for 11 years. She did it well, better, I suspect, than your father ever managed. It must be very difficult to relinquish what one has built, particularly to a stranger. You are not a stranger. You are my wife. I have been your wife for 12 days. I am very much a stranger." She paused. "But I am also the Duchess of Stannard, and this is my house. Both things are true, and I can hold them both without difficulty. The question is whether you can." He sat in the chair opposite hers, a chair that had been his father's, he realized, in a room where his parents had once negotiated the quiet territories of their own marriage. The symmetry of it struck him with an unexpected tenderness. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Nothing," Nothing, she said. This is not yours to resolve. Your mother and I will come to our own terms. What I needed from you, what I needed today, was simply that you not undermine me in my own house, that you not ask me to surrender what is mine in order to keep the peace. I can manage your mother, Ambrose. I cannot manage your mother and you. It was the most she had said to him in 12 days of marriage. He felt the weight of every word, the precision of them, the absolute absence of self-pity, the calm authority of a woman who had entered a house that did not want her and planted herself in its heart without raising her voice. You will not have to, he said. She looked at him, really looked, the first unguarded assessment he had seen from her, and what he found in her expression was not gratitude. It was something more careful than that, more provisional. The beginning of trust, held at arm's length, offered conditionally, capable of being withdrawn at any moment if the conditions were not met. He would have to earn the rest of it. He understood that now. The following morning, Ambrose came down to breakfast to find his mother already seated at the head of the table, as she had been every morning for 11 years. Matilda was not yet down. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Eugenia butter her toast with the serene authority of a woman who had occupied that chair for 3 decades and intended to occupy it for 3 more, and something turned over inside him, quiet, decisive, irreversible. He walked to the sideboard, filled his plate, and sat down, not in his usual seat to her right, but at the head of the table. Eugenia looked up, her knife paused against the toast. You are in my chair, she said. I am in mine, he replied. It is the Duke's chair. Matilda will sit at the other end. The silence lasted 4 seconds. He counted them the way Mrs. Halkett had counted the seconds of the standoff upstairs, with the focused attention of a person who understood that certain silences were the sound of the world rearranging itself. I see, Eugenia said. She moved with immaculate dignity to the chair at his right hand. She did not look at her son. She did not speak for the remainder of the meal. Her toast went cold and she did not touch it, and Ambrose ate his eggs and felt for the first time in his adult life like the Duke of Stannard. When Matilda appeared 20 minutes later, she found her husband at the head of the table and his mother seated to the side, and she understood, from the position of the chairs, from the angle of Eugenia's jaw, from the particular quality of silence in the room, from the cold toast on the dowager's plate, exactly what had happened. She sat at the foot of the table. She poured her own tea. She said, Good morning, Mrs. Halkett, and Mrs. Halkett answered her directly without glancing at the dowager first. It was a small thing, the size of a chair, the direction of a housekeeper's gaze, but the household felt it as one feels a change in the weather, a shift in the air, a new orientation, the certain knowledge that what had been was no longer what would be. Over the next fortnight, the transfer of authority continued in increments so precise they might have been choreographed. The household keys passed from Eugenia's chatelaine to Matilda's, not demanded, but requested, with a courtesy so exact it could not be refused without pettiness. The menus were discussed with Matilda first, then shared with the dowager as a kindness, not a consultation. The tradesmen began directing their invoices to Mrs. Halkett rather than to the dowager's parlor. Haslam brought the estate ledgers to Matilda's morning room and walked her through the accounts with the careful patience of a man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone who would actually read them. Matilda read them. She read every page, asked questions about the yields, about the tenant agreements, about the outstanding repairs to the south cottages. She did not challenge Eugenia's decisions. Most of them had been sound, and she said so, clearly and without condescension. Where she found inefficiencies, she addressed them with a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Eugenia observed all of this with the rigid composure of a woman watching her kingdom redistributed room by room. She did not rage. She did not weep. She sat in her reduced chair at the breakfast table and watched her daughter-in-law pour tea at the other end, and felt for the first time since her husband's death the particular loneliness of being no longer necessary. It was Matilda who noticed, not Ambrose. He was too relieved at the absence of conflict to observe its cost, but Matilda saw the way Eugenia's hand hesitated over her correspondence, the letters growing fewer. She saw the dowager walk to the garden and stand at the edge of the beds she had designed, watching the new plantings that Matilda had not changed, because she was not foolish enough to alter what was already beautiful. She saw the way Eugenia dressed each morning with the same impeccable care, the iron-gray hair pinned without a strand out of place, the posture as rigid as ever, and understood that this was not vanity but discipline, the last province of a woman who had lost everything else. On a Thursday afternoon in late spring, Matilda knocked on the door of the dowager's parlor, the small room Eugenia had kept, the one concession Matilda had not reclaimed, and asked if she might sit. Eugenia looked up from her embroidery with the expression of a woman bracing for a final blow. "The tenants at Witchford Farm," Matilda said, settling into the chair opposite without waiting for an invitation. "Mrs. Halkett tells me the eldest daughter is to be confined next month, and the family has very little. Your Grace has overseen the parish provisions for years. I wonder if you would advise me on what ought to be sent." Eugenia's needle stopped. She looked at Matilda over the frame of her embroidery, and something shifted in her face, not softening precisely, because Eugenia Kendrick did not soften. Recognition. The recognition of a woman who understood, with the bitter clarity of someone who had governed alone for a decade, that she was being offered a role rather than a relegation. That this young woman, who had taken her room, her keys, her household, and her authority with the steady precision of a siege that never raised its voice, was now offering her the one thing that mattered more than any of it: relevance. "The Witchford tenants prefer barley flour to wheat," Eugenia said after a moment, "and the mother has a weakness in her chest, a tincture of whorehound if cook can prepare it." "I did not know that," Matilda said. "Thank you." They sat together for an hour. They discussed the tenants, the parish almsgiving, the plans for the summer fete that Eugenia had organized for 11 years and still knew by heart, which farmers would contribute to the tables, which children would require new shoes, where the trestle tables should be placed to avoid the afternoon sun. Matilda asked questions and listened to the answers with a concentration that Eugenia had never received from her own son. She took notes in a small leather book she carried in her pocket. By the time the clock struck 4, something had been established between them that was not friendship, not yet, perhaps not ever in the way that word is commonly understood, but the foundation upon which respect might eventually become trust. The Dower House was mentioned for the first time in June, and it was Eugenia who raised it. "The Dower House wants new curtains," she said at breakfast, addressing no one in particular. "The morning room has not been touched since your grandmother's time, Ambrose. The silk is rotting on the rails." Ambrose looked up from his eggs. Matilda did not look up at all. She continued to spread marmalade on her toast, with the steady hand of a woman who understood that silence, at certain moments, was the most generous thing one could offer. "I shall have Haslam arrange it," Eugenia continued, "if the Duchess has no objection." "None whatsoever," Matilda said. "Shall I ask Mrs. Halkett to send the fabric samples to your parlor, or would you prefer to select them at the Dower House?" "At the Dower House," Eugenia said. "I should like to see the rooms in proper light." She moved the following week. Ridley oversaw the trunks, the same trunks, carried in a different direction, the same careful handling of possessions that represented a life. Eugenia supervised from the entrance hall with the bearing of a general relocating his command post, not retreating from the field. She had chosen this. She would have it known that she had chosen this. Matilde stood at the foot of the stairs and watched the procession with a face that gave nothing away, though Prue, standing behind her, saw her mistress's hands tighten briefly around the banister, a single private acknowledgement of what it cost to watch a formidable woman leave a house she had governed for 30 years. On the morning of her departure, Eugenia stopped in the doorway of the principal bedchamber, Matilda's room now, entirely Matilda's, with new curtains at the windows and Matilda's books on the nightstand and the faint scent of rosewater where lavender had been. Matilda was standing by the window, adjusting the same curtain she had adjusted on the first day. The gesture had become habitual, a small territorial ritual repeated each morning that she would perform for the next 40 years without ever quite noticing she was doing it. "You will find," Eugenia said from the doorway, "that the chimneys in the east corridor draw badly in November. Have Haslam attend to it before the first frost." "I shall," Matilda said. "Thank you, Your Grace." Eugenia nodded. She did not embrace her daughter-in-law. They were not there yet and might never arrive at such informality, but she inclined her head with a respect that cost her a great deal and meant more than she would ever say aloud. "You are not what I expected," Eugenia said. "No," Matilda agreed. I imagine I am not. I chose you because I believed you would be manageable. I know, Matilda said. And then, with the faintest trace of warmth in her voice, the first Eugenia had heard directed at her since the wedding. You chose well, Your Grace. You simply did not choose what you thought you were choosing. Eugenia looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned and walked down the corridor, her back straight, her step even, her bearing as immaculate as it had ever been. She did not look back. She did not need to. She knew exactly what she was leaving, and for the first time in 11 years, she was not afraid of what remained without her. 7 years later, on a winter evening when the candles in the Dower House drawing room were burning low, and the Dowager's grandchildren, 3 of them, the eldest, a girl of 5, with her mother's steady hazel eyes and her grandmother's iron will, had been put to bed after a long afternoon of biscuits and moral instruction, Eugenia Kendrick sat beside the fire and watched her daughter-in-law pour the tea. They dined together twice a week. This had been Matilda's idea, implemented in the first autumn after Eugenia's move, and maintained with the regularity of a parish schedule. The Dowager attended every dinner at the great house during the season. She advised on matters of estate management with an authority that Matilda respected and occasionally overruled, and Eugenia bore the overruling with a grace that had surprised them both at first, and now surprised neither. Ambrose had learned, over 7 years, that his household was governed by an alliance he did not fully understand and could not have disrupted if he had wished to. His wife and his mother communicated in a language of glances, silences, and barely perceptible nods that he could observe but never translate. They disagreed on the education of the children, on the management of the south pasture, and on whether barley soup was appropriate for a formal dinner. They agreed on almost everything else, including, Ambrose suspected, with the rueful certainty of a man who had finally grown into his own title, their assessment of him, which was fond but unsparing. He was mildly terrified of both of them. He considered this entirely appropriate. On the evening in question, Eugenia set down her teacup and regarded Matilda across the fire with the expression she reserved for matters of consequence. I chose you, she said, because I believed you would not interfere. Matilda smiled. It was the smile she permitted herself rarely, warm, unguarded, the kind of expression that still surprised Ambrose when he caught it across a crowded room or over the heads of their children at breakfast. I know, she said. I was wrong. Yes, I have never been more pleased to be wrong about anything in my life. Matilda poured more tea. The firelight caught the amber in her hair, the same amber that burned now in her eldest daughter's, and the house settled around them with the particular contentment of a place that knew itself to be well governed, not by one woman or another, but by both, the one who had built it and the one who had claimed it, sitting together beside a fire that neither had lit but both had tended. Ambrose, who had been reading in the corner and pretending not to listen, turned a page he had not read and said nothing. He had learned, over 7 years and 3 children and 1 standoff he would never forget, that the wisest thing a man could do in the presence of 2 extraordinary women was to remain very, very quiet. The candles burned on. Outside, the lime avenue stood bare against the winter sky, and the great house waited in the darkness beyond, lit in every window, warm in every room, governed with a precision that the late Duke would have admired, and the current Duke had the good sense not to question. They arrive here, like a room claimed and kept and filled with light whenever they are ready.